The GPS on my phone died somewhere around mile marker 127, leaving me to navigate the final stretch using handwritten directions that looked like they'd been photocopied about 50 times. The road twisted through dense forest that pressed close on both sides, branches occasionally scraping my windshield like skeletal fingers testing for weakness. 6 hours of driving through mountain passes had left my shoulders aching and my coffee long cold. When I finally reached the logging camp, it wasn't what I'd expected. The recruiting office in Vancouver had made it sound like a major operation, but what I found was a collection of weathered cabins arranged in a rough circle around a central mess hall that had seen better decades. 12 workers total, according to the paperwork I'd signed. The whole place felt temporary, like it could be packed up and moved at a moment's notice. I parked next to a row of pickup trucks that all looked like they'd been through a war, grabbed my duffel bag and headed for the mess hall where someone had taped a handwritten sign reading, "New arrivals report here." The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a room that smelled like coffee, diesel fuel, and something else I couldn't identify, something sharp and metallic that made my nose wrinkle. A stocky man with graying hair looked up from a clipboard. "You must be Sutherland. I'm Floyd Montgomery, foreman. You're just in time for dinner." The other workers glanced up from their plates with the kind of casual assessment that happens when someone new enters an established group. A woman with short black hair and calloused hands nodded at me from across the room. Another guy, lean and weathered, studied me with pale blue eyes before returning to his food. The conversations that had been happening when I walked in didn't resume. Floyd handed me a key attached to a wooden tag. "Cabin 7. Drop your gear and come back for food. We eat together here." Cabin 7 sat at the edge of the circle, close enough to the tree line that branches from the nearest pine almost touched the roof. Inside, I found a single room with a narrow bed, a small table, and a wood-burning stove that someone had left ready to light. The previous occupant had been neat. No personal items left behind, bed stripped and remade with military precision. I shoved my duffel under the bed and headed back to the mess hall where Floyd was ladling something that looked like stew into a metal bowl. The woman with black hair patted the bench beside her. "Chelsea Vega," she said, "equipment operator. You're the environmental engineer, right? Avery. And yeah, though I'm starting to think my degree didn't prepare me for this." I gestured toward the window, where the forest pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in. "None of our degrees prepared us for this," said the pale-eyed man. "Freddie Watkins, I handle survey and scouting." A woman with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes introduced herself as Winter. 15 years in remote ops. You'll get used to it." The stew was better than it looked, thick with chunks of meat and vegetables that tasted like they'd been simmering all day. I was halfway through the bowl when Floyd cleared his throat. "Listen up, everyone. Weather report came in. Full moons in 3 days, so we'll be pulling out Tuesday morning. Standard protocol." The announcement landed like a stone in still water. Nobody seemed surprised, but the tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Chelsea's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Freddie nodded like he'd been expecting it. Winter just kept eating, but her shoulders had gone rigid. "Pulling out?" I asked. "Because of the moon?" Floyd's steel-gray eyes met mine. "Company policy. We evacuate during full moons. Safety precaution." "What kind of safety precaution requires the kind that keeps people alive?" Winter said quietly. Her tone suggested the conversation was over. After dinner, I helped clear dishes while trying to process what I'd heard. Evacuating an entire logging operation because of lunar phases sounded like something from a bad horror movie, but nobody had been joking. These were serious people who'd been doing dangerous work for years, and they were genuinely concerned about something. Back in Cabin 7, I unpacked my clothes and set up my laptop, though the Wi-Fi password Floyd had given me didn't seem to work. The isolation was more complete than I'd expected. No cell service, no internet, just the sound of wind through pine branches and the occasional crack of settling wood. I was arranging my notebooks on the small table when my hand hit something wedged between the bed frame and the wall. A book stuck tight enough that I had to work it loose with my fingers. When it finally came free, I found myself holding a composition notebook with a black and white cover, the kind kids use in school. The edges were worn soft from handling, and someone had written L. Hayes on the front in block letters. The first page was dated 8 months ago, written in cramped handwriting that looked like it had been done in poor light. Day 1. Arrived at camp. Assigned cabin 7. Foreman Montgomery seems competent, but there's something he's not telling new workers. Overheard conversation between 2 veterans about protocols and the Northern Line. Need to pay attention. I flipped through several pages of routine observations, work schedules, equipment notes, personality assessments of other workers. Larry Hayes had been methodical, documenting everything with an engineer's attention to detail. Then I reached a page that made me stop. Day 23. Finally understand why they evacuate during full moons. Saw something at the tree line last night. Too tall to be human, moved wrong. Asked Freddie about it this morning. He just said to follow the rules and walked away. What rules? The next entry was longer. Day 31. Found out about the rules from Winter after she decided I could be trusted. Writing them down here so I don't forget. 1. Never stay in camp during a full moon. 2. Never approach the northern tree line alone. 3. If you see a small white dog in the forest, back away immediately. 4. Never take anything from the forest. No rocks, no wood, nothing. 5. If you hear your name called from the trees, don't answer and don't go outside. These aren't suggestions. Winter showed me photos of what happened to a worker named Brad who broke rule number 1 last year. I won't describe what I saw, but it wasn't a bear attack like the official report claimed. My hands had gone cold. I flipped ahead, finding more entries that described incidents, sightings, and something Larry called the Watchers. The handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed until the final entry 3 months ago. Day 127. They know I've been documenting everything. Freddie warned me to stop writing, said knowledge draws their attention. But I can't stop. Someone needs to record what's happening here. The Northern Section survey is scheduled for next week. Montgomery tried to talk me out of it, but the company wants those timber estimates. I'll be careful. I'll follow the rules. If something happens to me, whoever finds this notebook should know. They're not animals. They're something else. Something that was here long before the trees were cutting down. And they remember everything. The notebook ended there, but someone had tucked a loose piece of paper between the last pages. In different handwriting, someone had written, Larry went missing during the Northern Survey. His body was never found. F.W. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook. My first instinct was to dismiss it as an elaborate prank designed to scare new workers. Logging camps were notorious for hazing rituals, and this felt like exactly the kind of thing veterans would cook up to mess with someone's head. But I kept thinking about the expressions I'd seen at dinner, the way everyone had reacted to Floyd's evacuation announcement, the genuine tension that had filled the room when he mentioned the full moon. These weren't people playing games. I tucked the notebook into my jacket pocket. If it was a prank, I'd figure that out soon enough. If it wasn't. Around midnight, I was lying in bed listening to the forest settle for the night when I heard something moving outside. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin with deliberate, measured paces. Not the random wandering of a deer or the quick scurrying of smaller animals, but purposeful movement that suggested intelligence. The steps paused directly outside my window. I held my breath, waiting. Something large pressed against the glass. Not hard enough to break it, but with enough pressure that the frame creaked. Through the thin curtains, I could make out a shape that blocked most of the window. Too tall and too broad to be human, yellow eyes reflected the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. They stared directly at me through the glass, unblinking and patient. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The eyes watched me for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before they disappeared. The footsteps resumed their circuit around the cabin, slower now, as if whatever was out there was taking its time to examine every detail. They made 3 complete circles before fading into the forest, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and settling wood. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stumbled into the mess hall looking like I'd been hit by a truck. Chelsea was already there, nursing a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Rough night?" she asked, glancing up from a technical manual spread across the table. Something was outside my cabin, big, walking on 2 legs, had yellow eyes. Chelsea's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. She looked around the mess hall, confirming we were alone, then leaned closer. "You found Larry's notebook, didn't you?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. "How did you—" "Because you're asking the right questions and you look like someone who didn't get much sleep." She closed the manual and gave me her full attention. "Freddie saw you reading something last night through your window. He was doing his rounds." "Rounds?" "Someone always does a perimeter check before bed. We take turns. Last night was Freddie's shift." Chelsea's expression was serious now, all traces of casual conversation gone. "What did you think of what you read?" I pulled the notebook from my pocket and set it on the table between us. I thought it was a prank. Now I'm not so sure. Chelsea nodded slowly. "Keep it close. Read it carefully. And Avery." She waited until I met her eyes. "Don't think you're smarter than Larry was. He was a good man who followed the rules right up until he didn't." Freddie appeared in the doorway as if summoned, his pale eyes taking in the notebook on the table and the serious expressions on our faces. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from us. "She knows," Chelsea said simply. Freddie studied me for a long moment. "How much?" "Enough to be scared," I admitted. "Good. Scared keeps you alive out here." He gestured toward the notebook. Larry was documenting everything, trying to find patterns, make sense of it all. Smart man, but curiosity killed more than just cats. "What happened to him?" "He broke his own rules," Freddie said quietly. "Got too close to the northern tree line during a survey. We found his equipment scattered around a clearing, but no body. Just tracks leading deeper into the forest than anyone should go." Chelsea leaned back in her chair. "The company brought in search and rescue. Official investigation, the whole thing. Final report said he probably fell into a ravine and his body was carried off by scavengers. Case closed." "But you don't believe that." "I believe Larry knew exactly what he was walking into," Freddie said. "And he went anyway because he thought understanding them would keep everyone else safe." The 3 of us sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken knowledge settling over the table like fog. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of chainsaws starting up, the normal business of a logging operation beginning another day. "So what do I do?" I asked. Chelsea and Freddie exchanged a look. "You follow the rules," Freddie said. "All of them. And you hope that's enough." The evacuation ran like a military operation. Floyd stood by the trucks with his clipboard, checking off names as equipment got loaded with practiced efficiency. No casual conversation, no delays, just the steady rhythm of people who'd done this before and knew exactly how much time they had. "Sutherland, you're riding with Winter," Floyd called out, not looking up from his list. "Truck 3. I hefted my duffel bag and climbed into the passenger seat next to Winter, who was adjusting her rearview mirror with the kind of deliberate focus that suggested she was avoiding eye contact. The convoy pulled out in single file, Floyd's truck leading the way down the winding mountain road. 40 miles to the Pine View Motel," Winter said after we'd been driving in silence for 20 minutes. "We'll stay there until Wednesday morning." "This really happens every month?" "Every full moon. Company policy." She downshifted as we hit a steep grade. "Been that way since before I started here?" The motel sat at a crossroads where 2 highways met. The kind of place that survived on truckers and travelers who needed somewhere cheap to sleep. Floyd handled check-in while the rest of us stood around the parking lot like refugees, which I supposed we were in a way. "Room 12, Winter said, tossing me a key. "We're sharing. Hope you don't snore." The room had 2 double beds, a TV that probably predated cable, and carpet that had seen better decades. Winter dumped her bag on the bed closest to the window and immediately pulled the curtains shut. "Habit," she said when she caught me watching. "Don't like things looking in, including a worker named Brad who'd been found ripped apart after refusing to leave during a full moon 2 years before." Winter was watching some old movie with the volume turned low, but I could feel her attention shifting to me every few minutes. "You're reading it again," she said during a commercial break, trying to understand what happened to him. Winter muted the TV and turned to face me. Larry got too curious for his own good. Started asking questions that didn't have safe answers. I flipped to one of the later entries where Larry's handwriting had gotten more erratic. He wrote about someone named Brad. Said there were photos. Winter was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Happened about a year before Larry arrived. The headline read, "Logger Killed in Grisly Attack." The article was brief. Worker found dead near logging camp, body severely mauled, authorities warning about increased bear activity in the area. Standard stuff, except for one detail that made my stomach clench. The victim had been found during the day after a full moon, despite the evacuation protocol. "Brad thought the rules were stupid," Winter said. "Figured he was tough enough to handle whatever was out there. Hid in the equipment shed when everyone else left. And Freddie found him the next morning when we came back. What was left of him." Winter took the clipping back and refolded it carefully. Coroner said grisly attack because that was easier than trying to explain what really happened. Which was? Winter met my eyes. Something tore him apart with its bare hands. No claw marks, no bite patterns, just ripped him to pieces like he was made of paper. I felt cold despite the room's stuffy heat. The newspaper said what the authorities told them to say. Easier to blame a bear than admit they had no idea what killed him. The next evening, I found Floyd at the motel bar, nursing a whiskey that looked like it wasn't his first. The place was nearly empty except for a trucker playing video poker in the corner and a bartender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mind if I sit?" Floyd gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Free country. Though you might want something stronger than beer if you're planning to ask questions." I ordered a whiskey to match his. "How long have you been foreman?" 8 years. Long enough to see things that don't make sense." Floyd took a slow sip. "You want to know about Brad?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Found him myself, actually. Freddie was with me." Floyd's voice had gone flat, the way people sound when they're trying not to remember something clearly. Body was in the main clearing, right in the center, like it had been placed there on purpose. Winter said, "Winter told you it wasn't a bear attack. She's right." Floyd finished his whiskey and signaled for another. Footprints around the body were human-shaped but wrong. Too big, too deep. Like something that weighed twice what any person should weigh had been walking around on 2 legs. The bartender refilled Floyd's glass without being asked, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who recognized the signs. Coroner took one look and decided it was a grizzly, because that was the only thing that made sense to him. Sometimes people see what they need to see to sleep at night. "But you saw the real footprints." "I saw a lot of things that night. Tracks that led from the forest to where Brad was found, then back into the trees. Broken branches 12 feet up like something tall had pushed through them. And the smell..." Floyd shook his head. "Like ozone after lightning, mixed with something that reminded me of a morgue." Chelsea burst through the bar door before I could ask what he meant. her phone clutched in her hand and her face pale. "Floyd, you need to see this." "What's wrong?" "Motion cameras at camp sent a satellite alert before we lost connection. Something's moving around the buildings." Floyd was off his stool immediately, his earlier drunkenness forgotten. "Show me." Chelsea held up her phone, the screen displaying a grainy black and white image that had been automatically uploaded from one of the security cameras before the satellite connection went dark. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, shadows and shapes that could have been anything. Then something moved across the frame, and my breath caught. The figure was massive, easily 9 feet tall, walking upright between the cabins with a strange, deliberate gait. Its arms hung too long at its sides, and its head seemed too small for its body. As it passed directly in front of the camera, it turned to look straight into the lens. The eyes reflected the infrared light like an animal's, but the intelligence behind them was unmistakably aware. It knew it was being watched, and it didn't care. Floyd grabbed the phone from Chelsea's hands and immediately started pulling out the SIM card. "Nobody else sees this. Nobody talks about it." "Floyd, what are you—" He snapped the SIM card in half and dropped the pieces into his whiskey glass. "Some things are better left unknown. Trust me on this." The broken pieces of plastic sank to the bottom of the amber liquid like tiny shipwrecks. Chelsea stared at her ruined phone, then at Floyd, then at me. "We go back to the rooms," Floyd said quietly. "We don't discuss what we just saw. And we sure as hell don't try to get more footage." Walking back across the parking lot, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes staring directly into the camera. Whatever was moving around our empty camp knew exactly what it was doing, and it wanted us to know it was there. In room 12, Winter was pretending to read a magazine, but I could tell she'd been watching through the window. "How bad?" she asked, without looking up. "Bad enough that Floyd destroyed the evidence." Winter nodded like she'd expected as much. Some knowledge is too dangerous to keep around. Larry never understood that. I sat on my bed, still seeing those reflected eyes in my mind. "What do you think it wants?" "I think it wants us to stay away. And I think we're smart enough to listen." But even as she said it, I could see Larry's notebook on my nightstand, full of questions that still needed answers. The problem with curiosity is that once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop. The claw marks cut through the wood of my cabin door like it was cardboard. 4 parallel gouges, each one deep enough that I could stick my finger inside them up to the second knuckle. They started about 3 feet up and dragged all the way to the top of the door frame. 8 feet at least. "Jesus," I breathed, running my hand along the splintered wood. The marks were fresh, the exposed pine still bleeding sap that caught the morning light like amber tears. Floyd's voice carried across the clearing as he surveyed the damage to the other buildings. Mess hall, equipment shed, and cabin 3 all hit the same way. Nobody touches anything until I've documented it. Chelsea emerged from the equipment shed holding a measuring tape, her face grim. 8.5 feet on the shed. Whatever did this was tall enough to reach the roof line. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, then remembered we had no cell service. Instead, I grabbed my notebook and started sketching the claw marks, trying to capture the angle and depth. The gouges weren't random. They followed a deliberate pattern, like something had been testing the strength of the wood. "Company's sending a wildlife specialist," Floyd announced, walking over to examine my door. "Official story is aggressive bear behavior due to drought conditions pushing them closer to human settlements." Winter snorted from where she was hammering boards over the mess hall windows. "Right. Bears that walk on their hind legs and have opposable thumbs." "You see thumb marks?" I asked, looking more closely at the scratches. "Look at the spacing," she said, pointing with her hammer. 4 claws, but there's a gap where a thumb would be, like it was gripping the wood while it tore. The thought made my stomach clench. I'd seen bear claw marks before during my forestry training. These were different, more purposeful, more intelligent. like something had been trying to get inside rather than just marking territory. We spent the morning boarding up the damaged areas and reinforcing the doors. Floyd had us working in pairs, nobody going anywhere alone. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if everything was holding its breath. Around noon, I volunteered to check the equipment shed for damaged tools. It sat closer to the northern tree line than the other buildings, maybe 30 yards from where the forest began in earnest. As I walked across the clearing, the hair on my arms started standing up. The silence hit me first. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no insects buzzing, just the sound of my boots on pine needles and my own breathing. By the time I reached the shed, the quiet was so complete it felt like being underwater. I fumbled with the padlock, my hands shaking for reasons I couldn't explain. The metal felt ice cold, despite the warm afternoon sun. Behind me, the forest waited with the patience of something that had been watching for a very long time. "Don't turn around," a voice said quietly behind me. I spun anyway, my heart hammering against my ribs. Freddie stood about 10 feet away, his pale eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. "What?" "Walk toward me. Slowly. Don't look back at the tree line." I followed his instructions, fighting every instinct that wanted me to glance over my shoulder. When I reached him, Freddie grabbed my arm and guided me back toward the main clearing, his grip tight enough to bruise. What the hell was that about? "You felt it, didn't you? The watching?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Larry wrote about that spot," Freddie said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Said there were symbols carved into the trees along the northern line, markings that predated any known settlements in this area. He thought they were territorial markers, warnings. Warnings about what? About crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed." We'd made it halfway back to the mess hall when Freddie stopped abruptly, his hand tightening on my arm. "Larry also wrote that the symbols changed," Freddie continued. "New ones appearing overnight, old ones disappearing, like something was updating the message." "Updating it how?" "Making it more specific, more personal." Freddie released my arm and stepped back. "Stay away from the northern line, Avery. Whatever's out there knows you're here now." That afternoon, Floyd assigned me to timber cutting in the eastern section, as far from the northern tree line as the operation extended. I worked with Winter and 2 other guys, the steady rhythm of chainsaws providing some comfort after the morning's tension. I was limbing a fallen pine when I saw it. The dog sat perfectly still between 2 massive firs, white as fresh snow against the dark bark. Medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, with the pointed ears and thick coat of a husky mix. But it was the eyes that made me stop breathing. Blue. Not the pale blue of most huskies, but deep sapphire blue that seemed to glow with their own light. And intelligent. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but something far more complex. Something that was studying me with the same intensity I was studying it. I remembered Larry's 3rd rule. If you see a small white dog in the forest, back away immediately. My chainsaw died as I released the trigger. The sudden silence felt deafening after hours of mechanical noise. The dog tilted its head slightly, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. I set the chainsaw down carefully and took a step backward. The dog remained motionless, watching. Another step back. Still nothing. But when I turned to walk toward the main clearing, I heard the soft whisper of paws on pine needles behind me. It was following. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, not running but not dawdling either. Every 20 seconds or so, I glanced back. The dog maintained exactly the same distance, close enough that I could see the details of its face, far enough that it could disappear into the trees if I made any sudden moves. The other workers noticed immediately when I emerged from the forest with my 4-legged escort. "Holy shit," one of them breathed, reaching for his radio. "Don't," Winter said sharply. "Nobody makes any sudden movements." The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, sitting back on its haunches like a well-trained pet waiting for permission to enter. It watched me cross the open ground, those blue eyes never wavering. When I reached the mess hall steps, it stood, turned, and walked back into the forest with the same deliberate pace it had maintained while following me. "Well," Winter said after it disappeared, "that's not good." Chelsea found me an hour later, sitting on my cabin steps and staring at the tree line. She settled beside me without saying anything, following my gaze toward the spot where the dog had vanished. "I saw the same one 3 months ago, the day before Larry went missing," she said finally. "Winter mentioned that. Larry was convinced it wasn't really a dog, said it was something else wearing the shape of one." Chelsea pulled a thermos from her jacket and offered it to me. Coffee, still warm. Never explained what he meant by that. I took a sip, grateful for the warmth. "Any theories?" "Plenty, none of them good." She was quiet for a moment. "Larry wrote that the dog always appeared before something significant happened, like an early warning system." "Warning of what?" "Change, usually the bad kind." The coffee tasted like ashes in my mouth. "So what happens now?" "Now you follow the rules, all of them, and you hope that's enough." That night, I lay in bed listening to the forest settle around the camp. The new boards over my windows blocked most of the moonlight, leaving the cabin darker than usual. I'd just started to drift off when I heard it. Avery. My name, spoken in a voice I recognized but couldn't place. Soft, feminine, carrying the kind of warmth that made you want to respond immediately. "Avery, sweetheart." My mother's voice. Impossible since she'd been dead for 3 years, but unmistakably hers. The same gentle tone she'd used when I was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Come outside, honey. I need to show you something." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Larry's 5th rule echoed in my mind. If you hear your name called from the trees, don't answer and don't go outside. But it sounded so much like her. So real. "Avery, please. I've been waiting for you." I stumbled to my feet, moving toward the door before I caught myself. My hand was already on the doorknob when rational thought kicked in. My mother was dead. Whatever was calling my name from the forest wasn't her. I backed away from the door and grabbed the cotton balls from my first aid kit, stuffing them deep into my ears until the voice became muffled and distant. Then I started humming, loudly, tunelessly, anything to drown out the sound. The voice continued for hours. Sometimes it was my mother, sometimes my college roommate, once even my high school boyfriend calling my name with increasing urgency. But I kept humming, kept the cotton in my ears, and stayed away from the windows. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped. I removed the cotton and listened to the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, wind through branches, the distant sound of Floyd starting the generator. Everything back to normal, as if the night's terror had been a dream. But when I opened my door to head to the mess hall, I found fresh footprints in the dirt. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, too long, too narrow, with spaces between the toes that suggested claws. They circled my cabin 3 times before heading back into the forest, following a path that led directly toward the northern tree line. I stood there staring at the tracks, understanding with perfect clarity that whatever had been calling my name had been close enough to touch my door, close enough to smell my fear through the thin walls, and it would be back. I found Jackson Barnes sitting on the tailgate of his shiny new pickup truck, scrolling through his phone like he expected to find cell service if he just tried hard enough. The guy looked like he'd walked out of an REI catalog. Everything perfectly matched and obviously expensive, from his high-tech hiking boots to the fleece jacket that probably cost more than I made in a week. "You must be the new guy," I said, walking over with my coffee mug. "Avery Sutherland." He glanced up from his phone with the kind of smile that suggested he was already planning to explain how things really worked around here. "Jackson Barnes, Environmental Science, University of Vermont. You're the engineer, right?" "That's me." I gestured toward the mess hall. "Floyd's probably looking for you. We start early here." "Right. The foreman. Jackson pocketed his phone and hopped down from the truck. I read through the company manual on the drive up. Pretty standard operation, though some of the safety protocols seem excessive for basic timber work. Something in his tone made me pause. Which protocols? The evacuation policy, mainly. Shutting down an entire operation because of lunar phases. Seems like someone's been watching too many horror movies. He laughed, but it came out forced. I mean, I get that wildlife activity increases during full moons, but there are more efficient ways to manage that risk. I felt cold coffee settle in my stomach like a stone. Have you talked to any of the other workers about that? Not yet, but I plan to. Sometimes fresh eyes can identify inefficiencies that people miss when they've been doing things the same way for too long. Before I could figure out how to respond to that, Floyd emerged from the mess hall and spotted us. His expression shifted when he saw Jackson, like he was already calculating problems. Barnes, you're late for orientation. Sorry about that. I was just discussing operational efficiency with... Save it for later. Floyd cut him off. Right now, you need to learn how things work here before you start suggesting improvements. I watched Jackson's jaw tighten at the dismissal, but he followed Floyd inside without arguing. Through the window, I could see Floyd pulling out his standard orientation materials, while Jackson sat with the posture of someone humoring a child. This was going to be a problem. At lunch, Jackson held court at one of the long tables, explaining to anyone who'd listen why the camp's protocols were based on outdated thinking. Most of the veteran workers ignored him, but I could see Chelsea and Winter exchanging looks across the room. The evacuation policy alone probably costs the company thousands in lost productivity, Jackson was saying to a couple of newer guys who seemed genuinely interested. Modern wildlife management techniques could easily address whatever issues they're trying to solve. I set my tray down across from him. What kind of issues do you think they're trying to solve? Increased predator activity during full moons, obviously. It's well documented that large carnivores hunt more aggressively when there's better visibility. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd read about these things in textbooks. But motion-activated lighting and proper food storage protocols would be far more effective than complete evacuation. Winter snorted from 2 tables over. Motion-activated lighting. That's rich. Jackson turned toward her, his expression sharpening. I'm sorry, did you have something to add? Just that you might want to learn what you're dealing with before you start redesigning the system. And what exactly am I dealing with? The mess hall had gone quiet. Even the newer workers sensed the tension building between Winter's experience and Jackson's academic certainty. Things that don't care about your motion-activated lights, Winter said simply. Jackson's laugh was genuinely amused this time. Right. Things. Very scientific. I pulled Larry's notebook from my jacket pocket and slid it across the table. You might want to read this before you make any final judgments. Jackson picked up the notebook, flipping through the first few pages with the kind of expression people get when they're trying not to roll their eyes. Whose is this? Guy who had your job before you. Larry Hayes. Where is he now? Missing, Floyd said from the doorway. Went into the northern section during a survey and never came back. Jackson looked up from the notebook. What happened to him? Nobody knows. But he followed every safety protocol right up until the day he disappeared. I watched Jackson process that information, saw him weigh it against his own assumptions about how the world worked. For a moment, I thought he might actually take the warning seriously. Then he closed the notebook and handed it back to me. I'm sorry about your colleague, but anecdotal accounts aren't really evidence of anything except the need for better safety training. The mess hall stayed quiet for another few seconds. Then conversations resumed, but the easy atmosphere was gone. Jackson had drawn his line in the sand, and everyone knew it. 3 days later, Floyd assigned me to work with Jackson on clearing operations in the eastern section. The guy was competent with the equipment, I had to give him that. His chainsaw work was clean and efficient, and he understood timber grading better than most people with twice his experience. But he wouldn't shut up about the superstitious nonsense he'd been hearing around camp. "It's actually fascinating from an anthropological perspective," he said during our lunch break, gesturing with half a sandwich. "Isolated communities always develop elaborate folklore to explain natural phenomena they don't understand." I was getting tired of his lectures. "What if it's not folklore?" "Come on, Avery. You're an engineer. You know better than to buy into ghost stories." "I know better than to dismiss evidence without examining it." "What evidence?" "A notebook full of paranoid ramblings and some scratches on a door that could have been made by any large animal." He had a point about the scratches. Without context, they could have been bear damage. But context was exactly what he refused to consider. "The evacuation policy exists for a reason," I said. "The evacuation policy exists because someone made a decision based on fear instead of facts, and now it's become institutionalized." Jackson stood up and brushed crumbs off his pants. "But policies can be changed when presented with better information." That afternoon, we were limbing a massive pine that had come down near a creek when Jackson's chainsaw hit something that wasn't wood. The blade kicked back hard enough that he had to fight to keep control, and when the engine died, we could hear metal grinding against stone. "What the hell?" Jackson knelt beside the trunk, examining the cut. "There's something embedded in here." I walked over to look. About 3 feet up from the base, something dark was wedged deep in the heartwood. Jackson had already started digging it out with his pocket knife. "Careful," I said. "Could be an old nail or piece of equipment." But when he finally worked it loose, we both stared at what he held in his palm. It was a spearhead, maybe 4 inches long and perfectly preserved despite being buried in living wood for who knows how many years. The stone was black with veins of what looked like silver running through it, and the carving was intricate beyond anything I'd seen in museums. "Holy shit," Jackson breathed. "This is incredible. Look at the craftsmanship." The symbols carved into the stone seemed to shift in the afternoon light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. I felt the same cold sensation I'd experienced near the northern tree line, like something was watching us from just outside my peripheral vision. "Put it back," I said. "Are you kidding? This could be a significant archaeological find. The dating alone..." "Jackson, put it back. Now." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Why would I put back what might be the most important artifact discovered in this region in decades?" "Because Larry's 4th rule says never take anything from the forest." Larry's 4th rule. Jackson's voice dripped with contempt. "Right. Well, Larry's not here, and I'm not about to let superstition override scientific discovery." He slipped the spearhead into his jacket pocket despite my protests. The moment it disappeared from view, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The normal sounds of the forest, birds, insects, wind through leaves, cut off like someone had thrown a switch. "You feel that?" I asked. Jackson was already shouldering his chainsaw. "Feel what?" "Come on, we've got 3 more trees to clear before quitting time." But I could see goosebumps on his arms, and his breath was starting to mist in air that had been warm minutes before. We finished the day's work in silence that felt increasingly oppressive. Every time I glanced at Jackson, he seemed paler than before, and by the time we loaded our equipment into the truck, his hands were shaking. "You okay?" I asked as we drove back to camp. "Fine, just tired." But sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold that had settled over everything. At dinner, Jackson picked at his food without eating much. His skin had taken on a grayish tinge that made him look like he was coming down with something serious. When Chelsea asked if he was feeling all right, he insisted he was fine, but his voice came out hoarse and strained. "Maybe you should see the camp medic," Floyd suggested. I said I'm fine. Jackson stood up abruptly, swayed on his feet, then steadied himself against the table. "Just need some sleep." He made it halfway to the door before collapsing. Floyd and Winter carried him to the medical cabin while Chelsea ran for the first aid kit. By the time I caught up, Jackson was conscious but delirious, his skin burning with fever and his eyes darting around the room like he was tracking something none of us could see. "They're moving," he whispered, grabbing Floyd's shirt. "Under my skin. I can feel them moving." Floyd checked his temperature with a digital thermometer that beeped angrily when it hit 104 degrees. "When did this start?" "This afternoon," I said. "Right after." Jackson's scream cut me off. He arched his back, clawing at his arms like he was trying to tear something out of his flesh. "Get them out, please, get them out." "Hold him down," Floyd ordered, but Jackson's strength was inhuman. It took all four of us to keep him on the cot as he thrashed and screamed about shadows moving through his bloodstream. "The spearhead," I said suddenly. "He found a carved spearhead in the forest and took it." Floyd's expression went grim. "Where?" "Eastern section, near the creek, embedded in a fallen pine." "Same symptoms as Cam," Winter said quietly. Floyd nodded. "We need to get him back there. Now." "Back where?" I asked, but Floyd was already lifting Jackson's shoulders. "Help me carry him, and bring a flashlight." The walk back to the fallen pine took 20 minutes in the dark, with Jackson alternating between periods of unconsciousness and violent hallucinations. Twice he tried to bite Winter when she helped support his weight. By the time we reached the tree, his fever had climbed so high that his skin was radiating heat like a furnace. "The artifact," Floyd said. "Where is it?" I searched Jackson's pockets until I found the spearhead, now so cold it burned my fingers through my gloves. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own light in the beam of my flashlight. "Put it back where you found it," Floyd ordered. I knelt beside the cut in the trunk and pressed the spearhead into the exposed heartwood. The moment it made contact, Jackson's screaming stopped. His body went limp, and for a terrifying second I thought he was dead. Then he took a shuddering breath, and another, and his eyes fluttered open. "What happened?" he whispered. "You learned why we have rules," Winter said. We helped him back to camp where his fever broke completely within an hour. But the experience had changed him. The academic arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like shell shock. He wouldn't talk about what he'd experienced, just sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. "Cam took a similar artifact about 5 years ago," Floyd told me later as we cleaned up the medical cabin. "Same symptoms, same cure. But he never really recovered. Transferred out within a month." "What was it? The spearhead?" "Something that doesn't belong in human hands. Something that remembers being taken." That night I was lying in bed reading when I heard the soft padding of paws outside my cabin. Through a gap in the boards over my window, I could see the white dog sitting in the clearing, perfectly still except for its tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. I grabbed my notebook and moved to get a better view. The dog's blue eyes reflected the moonlight as it stared directly at my window like it knew I was watching. Then it stood, turned toward the northern tree line, and sat back down, waiting. Something moved between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at angles that made my eyes water. It emerged from the forest with a jerky, puppet-like gait that suggested its joints didn't work the same way human joints did. The darkness seemed to cling to its face, but its eyes burned with the same blue light as the dog's. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood motionless, arms hanging at its sides like broken branches. It had to be 9 feet tall at least, maybe 10. When it tilted its head, I heard vertebrae cracking like dry wood. I fumbled for my notebook, trying to sketch what I was seeing, but my hands were shaking too badly to draw anything coherent. The figure remained motionless for what felt like hours, just watching the camp with that patient, inhuman stillness. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the mess hall porch. Floyd emerged carrying his hunting rifle, though he held it like he knew it wouldn't do any good. The other workers followed, Winter, Chelsea, Freddie, even Jackson moving like a sleepwalker. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there in the moonlight, staring at the thing that stared back at us from the tree line. The white dog remained between us, perfectly calm, like this was exactly what it had expected. The standoff lasted until the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Then the figure took one step backward into the forest, and another, its eyes never leaving us until the trees swallowed it completely. The dog followed, trotting into the darkness with its tail still wagging. "Well," Winter said into the silence, "that was new." Floyd lowered his rifle. "Everyone back inside. Nobody talks about this until morning." But I knew we wouldn't talk about it then either. Some things were too big for words, too dangerous for discussion. We'd just add it to the growing list of experiences that couldn't be explained or shared. As I walked back to my cabin, I felt the weight of Larry's notebook in my pocket. Tomorrow I would add tonight's events to the pages, continuing the documentation that had cost him everything, because someone had to remember. Someone had to keep track of what lived in the spaces between the trees, watching and waiting for the next person to break the rules, even if that knowledge might destroy me too. The convoy was already loaded and ready to roll when Floyd made the announcement that sent ice through my veins. "We're pulling out a day early." Motion sensors picked up multiple heat signatures moving along the northern tree line in coordinated patterns. I was shoving my duffel bag into Winter's truck when she grabbed my arm. "Multiple signatures means they're hunting in groups now. That's never happened before." Chelsea emerged from the equipment shed carrying a hard drive and looking like she'd seen a ghost. Thermal cameras caught 7 distinct figures moving in formation. They know we're here, and they're planning something. The urgency was infectious. Workers moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from genuine fear, loading only essential gear and leaving everything else behind. I was tossing my notebooks into my messenger bag when Larry's composition book fell open to a section I'd somehow missed before. Tucked between the back pages were several loose sheets covered in Larry's increasingly frantic handwriting. The first one was dated just 2 weeks before he disappeared. Found something in the county records office. Another logging operation worked this exact area in 1952. Mackenzie Timber Company. 43 workers. They just vanished one day, all of them. Official report blamed a landslide, but the geological survey found no evidence of any slide. Equipment was left running, food still warm on the tables, like they just walked away from everything. The next page made my hands shake. Talked to an elder from the local band who remembers stories about this place. She said her grandfather's generation made agreements with what she called the Old Ones. Forest spirits that had been here since before the ice. The agreements established boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Modern logging operations don't know about these agreements. We've been breaking sacred laws without realizing it. The final page was barely legible. 6th rule. Most important. Never try to understand what lives here. Knowledge itself draws their attention. The more you learn, the more they notice you. The more they notice you, the more they want to. The sentence ended in a dark smear across the paper, like he'd been interrupted mid-thought. "Avery, we're moving." Floyd's voice cut through my concentration. I stuffed the pages back into the notebook and climbed into Winter's truck. As we pulled away from camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us leave from the northern tree line. "You found more of Larry's writing," Winter said, glancing at the notebook in my lap. "He was researching the history of this place. Found records of another logging crew that disappeared in 1952. Winter's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. 43 workers. I know about that. You know about it? My grandmother told me stories. Said this whole area was sacred ground protected by agreements that the white logging companies never bothered to learn about. Winter downshifted as we hit a steep grade. She also said the forest remembers everything. Every tree cut, every boundary crossed, every promise broken. The convoy wound down the mountain road in single file, Floyd's truck leading the way with its emergency flashers blinking like a heartbeat. Through the rear window, I could see Chelsea's truck following us, and behind that, the rest of the crew stretched out in a line of headlights. "Winter," I said carefully, "have you been documenting what's been happening here?" She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Been collecting audio for 3 years. Started as a way to document safety violations for the union. But then I started picking up other things." "What kind of other things?" Winter hit play. The speaker crackled with static, then filled with the normal sounds of forest at night. Wind through branches, distant owl calls, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. But underneath those familiar sounds was something else. Voices, speaking in a language that didn't sound like anything human throats could produce. Multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in patterns that might have been conversation or might have been something else entirely. "Jesus," I breathed. "That's from 2 nights ago, recorded about 50 yards from the northern tree line." Winter stopped the playback. "But listen to this one." The next clip was shorter but more disturbing. The same inhuman voices, but clearer now, speaking with what sounded like increasing urgency. And underneath their alien conversation, I could hear something that made my stomach clench. A human voice, male, speaking English words I couldn't quite make out. "Is that Larry's voice?" Recorded 3 days after he went missing. Winter's hands were trembling slightly as she put the recorder away. Whatever those things are, they didn't just kill him. They kept him. The radio crackled to life with Freddie's voice from the lead truck. "Floyd, we've got a problem. There's someone standing in the road." The convoy slowed, then stopped completely. Through the windshield, I could see Floyd's truck about 100 yards ahead, its headlights illuminating a figure standing motionless in the center of the access road. "Can you see who it is?" Floyd's voice came through the radio. "Looks like Larry," Freddie replied, but his tone suggested that wasn't good news. I grabbed my binoculars from my bag and focused on the figure. It was definitely human-shaped, wearing clothes that looked like the work gear Larry would have worn, but something was wrong with the proportions. The arms hung too long and the head tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for a living person. "Floyd, don't get out of the truck," Winter said into her radio. "That's not Larry." But Floyd was already opening his door. Through the binoculars, I watched him walk slowly toward the figure, his rifle held ready but not aimed. The distance between them closed to maybe 20 feet before Floyd stopped. The Larry thing turned its head to look at him. Even from this distance, I could see the blue glow where its eyes should have been, the same sapphire blue as the white dog's eyes. Floyd raised his rifle. The thing that looked like Larry opened its mouth. The sound that came out shattered every piece of glass in Floyd's truck. Windows, windshield, mirrors, even the gauge faces on the dashboard. The noise hit our convoy a second later, a subsonic roar that seemed to come from deep underground. Winter's windshield spider-webbed, and I felt the sound in my bones like a physical force. Floyd stumbled backward, dropping his rifle and clapping his hands over his ears. The Larry thing kept its mouth open impossibly wide, that terrible sound pouring out of it like water from a broken dam. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. The Larry thing looked directly at our convoy, its blue eyes finding each vehicle in turn. When its gaze reached our truck, I felt something cold pass through me like an X-ray made of ice. It knew I was watching. It knew I had been documenting everything. Then it began walking backward into the forest, never breaking eye contact, never turning around. Its movements were wrong, too fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. The trees seemed to part for it, branches bending aside without being touched. It disappeared into the darkness between the pines, but I could still feel those blue eyes watching us from the shadows. Floyd stumbled back to his ruined truck, glass crunching under his boots. His radio crackled with static before his voice came through, shaky but determined. All vehicles, proceed through this position immediately. Do not stop. Do not look into the forest. We're getting the hell out of here. Winter put our truck in gear and drove toward where the Larry thing had been standing. As we passed through that spot, the temperature inside our cab dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath misted and frost began forming on the inside of our cracked windshield. Something moved alongside us in the trees, keeping pace with our convoy as we descended the mountain. I caught glimpses of pale shapes flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of the headlight beams. The white dog appeared and disappeared like a ghost, sometimes running ahead of us, sometimes falling behind, but always there. We didn't stop until we reached the Pineview Motel, 40 miles away. Floyd's truck limped into the parking lot with no glass left in any of its windows and a radiator that was leaking coolant onto the asphalt. In the motel office, Floyd looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His hands shook as he signed the register, and there were small cuts on his face from flying glass. "We're done," he said to the group of workers gathered in the parking lot. "I'm recommending immediate and permanent closure of the operation." Nobody argued. Even Jackson, who'd been questioning everything since his experience with the spearhead, just nodded silently. "What about our jobs?" one of the newer guys asked. "There'll be other jobs," Floyd said. "Jobs that don't require you to work in places that belong to something else." Later, in room 12, Winter and I sat on our respective beds trying to process what we'd experienced. The local news was playing on the old TV, something about weather patterns and crop reports, normal things from a normal world that suddenly felt very far away. "That thing on the road," I said. "It wasn't Larry, was it?" "No, but it used to be." Winter was cleaning glass fragments out of her hair. "I think they keep pieces of the people they take. Memories, maybe. Enough to wear their shapes when they need to." I pulled out Larry's notebook and read through his final entries again. His warnings about knowledge drawing their attention felt more urgent now. I'd been documenting everything, just like he had. Taking notes, making sketches, asking questions, and they'd noticed. "Winter, what happens if corporate doesn't approve the closure?" She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Then we don't go back. Simple as that. And if they try to force us, then they'll have to find new crews. Because everyone who's seen what we've seen tonight knows the truth now." Winter turned off the TV and pulled her blanket up to her chin. "Some places aren't meant for humans to work. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed." I lay in the dark, listening to the normal sounds of the motel, traffic on the highway, the ice machine humming down the hall, someone's TV playing too loud in the next room. Human sounds from a human world. But I couldn't stop thinking about those blue eyes in the forest, watching and waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that even here, 40 miles away from the camp, we weren't really safe. Because now, they knew who we were. They'd seen our faces, learned our scents, heard our voices, and according to Larry's notebook, they never forgot anything. I stared at the map spread across Chelsea's motel bed, my coffee growing cold as I traced the pattern of red dots with my finger. Each mark represented an incident, deaths, disappearances, sightings that couldn't be explained away. The clustering was unmistakable. 47 documented cases over the past 15 years, Chelsea said, pointing to the northern section. All within a 5-mile radius of this area. Winter leaned over my shoulder, her finger tapping a section where the red dots formed an almost perfect circle. "And look at this, satellite imagery from last month." She pulled out a manila folder containing aerial photographs that made my stomach drop. The forest canopy showed several perfectly circular clearings arranged in a geometric pattern that definitely wasn't natural. Each clearing was maybe 30 feet across, connected by what looked like paths that formed a larger design. "Jesus," I breathed. "How long have these been here?" "That's the thing," Chelsea said. These photos are from different dates over the past 3 years. The pattern's been growing, expanding outward from a central point. I studied the images more closely. The clearings weren't random. They formed a complex symbol that hurt to look at directly, like the carvings on the spearhead Jackson had found. Have you shown this to Floyd? Floyd knows. He's the one who requested the satellite surveys. Winter sat on the edge of the bed. Corporate kept denying the requests until he started filing incident reports that mentioned unexplained wildlife behavior patterns. So what do you think it is? Chelsea and Winter exchanged a look that suggested they'd already discussed this extensively. We think it's a territory marker, Chelsea said finally. Something that's been claiming this area piece by piece, establishing boundaries that we've been crossing without permission. The elder I talked to called them the Old Ones, Winter added. Said they've been here since before the Ice Age, just waiting for the forest to grow back after the glaciers retreated. I flipped through more photographs, noting how the clearings seemed to follow the natural contours of the land while maintaining their geometric precision. And we've been cutting trees right through the middle of their… what? Sacred ground? Territory. Hunting ground. Home. Winter shrugged. Does it matter what we call it? Point is, we're not supposed to be there. The sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot made us all look toward the window. 3 black SUVs with corporate plates were arranging themselves in a neat line outside the motel office. Well, Chelsea said, gathering up the photographs. Looks like we're about to find out if corporate takes this seriously. 20 minutes later, we were all crammed into the motel's tiny conference room, watching 3 men in expensive suits try to make sense of Floyd's incident reports. The lead guy, Henderson, according to his business card, kept shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a bad dream. Mr. Montgomery, these reports describe incidents that are difficult to substantiate. Floyd sat perfectly still across the table. Every incident is documented with witness statements, photographic evidence where possible, and detailed timelines. Photographic evidence of what exactly? Henderson pulled out a tablet and scrolled through digital copies of the reports. Scratches on buildings that could have been made by any large animal, footprints that could belong to local wildlife, audio recordings of… what did you call them? Unidentified vocalizations? Play the recordings, Floyd said quietly. Henderson's assistant, a nervous-looking woman named Torres, pulled out a small speaker and connected it to her laptop. The room filled with the same inhuman voices I'd heard in Winter's truck, speaking in that language that made my teeth ache. The 3 corporate representatives listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to confusion to something approaching fear. When the recording reached the part where Larry's voice could be heard underneath the alien conversation, Henderson held up his hand. Stop. What is that supposed to be? That's Larry Hayes, recorded 3 days after he went missing, Floyd said, the man whose disappearance prompted my closure recommendation. Mr. Hayes was declared dead after an extensive search and rescue operation. These recordings don't prove anything except that someone has an active imagination and access to audio editing software. I watched Floyd's jaw tighten. Mr. Henderson, with respect, you weren't there. You didn't see… I didn't see anything because there's nothing to see except a remote logging operation with a higher than average accident rate and a crew that's developed an unhealthy fixation on local folklore. Henderson closed his tablet with the kind of finality that suggested the meeting was over. The operation will resume Monday morning with additional safety protocols and a fresh crew rotation. Anyone who doesn't feel comfortable returning to work is free to request a transfer. That's when the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Our breath started misting in the suddenly frigid air. Henderson's tablet screen flickered and went dark. Torres's laptop emitted a high-pitched whine before shutting down completely. Through the conference room window, I could see something moving in the parking lot. The white dog sat perfectly centered between the 3 corporate SUVs, its blue eyes reflecting the afternoon sunlight like mirrors. It wasn't alone. 3 tall figures emerged from behind the vehicles, moving with that same jerky, puppet-like gait I'd seen at the tree line. In broad daylight, they were even more disturbing. Too thin, too tall, with limbs that bent at angles that made my eyes water. Their faces were shadows that the sunlight couldn't penetrate, but their eyes burned with the same sapphire fire as the dogs. Henderson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell?" The figures stopped moving. All 3 turned to look directly at the conference room window, their heads tilting in perfect unison like they were listening to something we couldn't hear. Torres tried to restart her laptop, but instead of booting up normally, the speakers began emitting the same alien language we'd heard in the recordings. The sound filled the small room, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Turn it off," Henderson said, his voice cracking. "I can't," Torres whispered. "It's not responding to anything." The corporate phones started ringing in sequence. Henderson's first, then Torres's, then the third man's. But when they answered, instead of dial tones or human voices, the same inhuman speech poured from the speakers. The language that predated human civilization, speaking words that our minds weren't designed to process. Outside, the 3 figures remained motionless, watching us with patient, alien intelligence. The white dog began walking in a slow circle around the SUVs, its tail wagging like this was all a game. "How long do we wait?" Chelsea whispered. Floyd checked his watch. "However long they want us to wait." 1 hour. That's how long the entities stood in the parking lot while we remained frozen in the conference room, afraid to move, afraid to speak above a whisper. The phones continued their alien chatter. The laptops and tablets stayed dark. The temperature remained cold enough that we could see our breath. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures stepped backward and faded into the bright afternoon air like heat mirages. The white dog trotted after them, disappearing last with one final look at our window. The electronics came back online immediately. The temperature returned to normal. The only evidence of what had happened was the smell of ozone hanging in the air and patches of frost on the windows despite the warm weather outside. Henderson sat down heavily, his face pale and his hands shaking. What was that?" "That," Floyd said calmly, "was why we evacuate during full moons." Torres was frantically checking her laptop, scrolling through files that showed no trace of the alien audio that had been pouring from its speakers minutes before. "The recordings are gone. Everything we captured today is just gone." "Good," Winter said. "Some things aren't meant to be documented." Henderson looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "The operation is closed, effective immediately. Permanent closure." "Smart choice," Floyd said. "Severance packages will be generous. Full benefits continuation. And there will be non-disclosure agreements." Henderson's voice was steadier now, but I could see sweat stains under his arms. "Very comprehensive non-disclosure agreements." 3 hours later, I was sitting in my truck in the motel parking lot with a check for 6 months' salary and a legal document that basically said I'd never speak of anything that had happened in the forest. I signed without reading the fine print. Some secrets were worth keeping. Winter knocked on my passenger window and I rolled it down. "You heading back to Minnesota?" "Eventually. Might take the scenic route." I gestured toward Larry's notebook on my dashboard. "Need some time to process all this." "Burn it," she said quietly. "When you're ready, burn that notebook and everything in it. Knowledge like that doesn't belong in the world." "What about the truth? Doesn't someone need to remember?" Winter smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The forest remembers. That's enough." I drove south through mountain passes that twisted between forests that looked exactly like the one we'd left behind. Every stand of pines made me check my rearview mirror. Every shadow between the trees made me press harder on the accelerator, but I kept the notebook. even knowing the danger, even understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. I couldn't bring myself to destroy Larry's final record. Someone had to remember what had happened to him, what had happened to all of us. 6 months later, I was working a desk job in Minneapolis when the package arrived. No return address, no postmark I could read, just my name written in block letters across brown paper wrapping. Inside was a single photograph, aerial view, showing our abandoned camp from maybe 1,000 feet up. The buildings were already being swallowed by new growth, vines and saplings, reclaiming the cleared ground with impossible speed. But it was the center of the main clearing that made my hands shake. Dozens of small white dogs sat in a perfect circle, all of them looking directly up at the camera. Their blue eyes reflected the sunlight like stars, and even in the photograph, I could feel them watching me. I burned the photo that night, along with Larry's notebook and every note I'd taken during my time in the forest. I watched the flames consume the evidence, the documentation, the proof that some places belong to things older and more dangerous than human understanding. The ashes scattered in the wind, carrying our secrets back to the darkness where they belonged. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I still hear that alien language in my dreams. And I know that somewhere in the forests of British Columbia, the old ones are still watching, still waiting, still remembering everyone who dared to cross their boundaries. They never forget anything. And they know exactly where to find me.